Hello and welcome. In this lecture, I'd like to provide a demonstration of how you can create a bounded service. For this lecture, we're going to have a bounded service that logs information to external storage. It's just going to act as a logger. It's going to have a timestamp, and whatever message you send to the service, it will log that data. So this is a bounded service, and it will only be available in the lifetime of the application that binds to it. So let's start off by creating the service and creating a new Android Studio project. I'm going to name my application Logging Service. And I'm going to keep all the defaults as they are. So I'm going to hit Next. Another Next. I'm not going to add activity because a service doesn't have a user interface and I don't want an activity. So I'm going to hit Finish. And this is going to create our service application that's empty. First thing what I want to do is before I create any source files, I want to modify the manifest file. And inside the manifest file, I want to declare my service, and I also want to set some permissions. Now the permissions are going to be tricky because you can't request runtime permissions in a service because a service doesn't have an activity. So I'm going to have the permissions in the manifest file, but inside the emulator, I'm going to go ahead and grant them when I install the service. I'm not going to ask them for them at runtime. It's a workaround. It's mainly needed again because services don't have a user interface and so they can't grant permissions. So let's just go ahead and add the service to the manifest, and that will mainly be it. So we can add the service inside the application tag. We want to make sure that we don't close our application, so I'm going to just leave it like that, and I'm going to add my service element right here. My service element is required to have a name. It's the name of the class of where your service resides. I'm going to call my class Messenger Logging Service. I'm going to also allow it to be exported so that other applications can use it. And I'm going to add an intent filter so that I can start it in another application. This is just your package name followed by the name, any name of the service that you want. I just called mine Log Service. I'm also going to request two permissions. Or I'm going to have two permissions in the manifest, but I'm not going to request them at runtime. So if I hit save here, I want to make sure I add my ending application. There we go. Let's make sure everything else looks right. I don't have that class created yet, so that's why that's red. I think everything else is good to go. So let's go to Java. Let's go to our source file. Let's add a new source file. Let's add a new Java class. We're going to name this Messenger Logging Service. And this needs to be a subclass of the service class, Android app. And again, this service class is all it's going to do is log some data to an external storage. So what you need to do to implement the service class, we need to extend that service. That's pretty important. I'm going to add an empty constructor. Just Messenger Service, Messenger Logging Service. I should have named it Logging. Misspelled. It's going to be an empty constructor. I want to refactor the name. Oh, it looks like, yeah, let's refactor this name so it's spelled correctly. Refactoring is a great option to use because it will handle all dependencies as well. We'll change the activity and everything. So if you has refactoring, it changes to refactoring, it will change the log class. If you go on the manifest, it will change that to what it should be if it was already in there. So now let's go back in here, and what we have to implement, I want to use a messenger for my service. So what we need to implement for the messenger service is we need to extend the handler class and implement the handle message method. So I'm going to create an inner class, because this is how you can override methods. I'm going to call it incoming handler, and it's going to extend the handler. And inside here, I'm going to override my handle message. I just need to add the override, and I need to handle message. I also have to import all the right classes. There is some ambiguity in the classes, so I'm just going to copy and paste those in. Mainly the OS classes we need for binding. And I also imported some Java IO classes so that I can write to external storage. Right now they're unused, but they will be used. And so what I need to do is, when I handle my message, I need to know what message is being sent. So I'm going to create a public static final message, an int, called save to file. And this is just going to be equal to 1. This is what I'm going to use to send my message in my application. I also want to, when I get my message, I want to check if it's that save to file, and if it is, I want to get some data from it and then log it. So I'm going to go ahead and implement this. And what I'm doing here is, when I get the save to file message, I'm going to get the data out of the bundle using the getString method. And I'm going to store it in a member variable. So let's store that in something called past string. We'll just call this string past string. This will be the string that's passed from the application. So again, what we're doing here is, when we get the message from the client, we're going to get the data out of it, store it in a member variable. We're going to call a helper method to write to your external storage, and then we're going to provide a toast message that just tells them what we logged. And on the default case, I'm going to call the super handle message. So now I need to add my helper method. The helper method, I'm not going to go into too much detail because it's just writing to external storage, and we've covered this already. But what this will do is it will take a string and it will create a file. I don't need this logs in here. In external storage, it will save it in the directory downloads, and it will just append it to external storage. And normally when you have external storage, you need to request permissions at runtime. I'm going to, because it's a service, and that's, you can't do that in a service because it doesn't have activity. I'm going to do it on the emulator. I'm going to manually allow it. The other things we need to implement for the service is we need to implement the onBind method, and we need to define our interface, which is from our bind. So I'm going to create our messenger object. It's going to handle the incoming object, and then in the onBind, I'm going to say get binder on this. So remember, in order to implement a service, you have to override that onBind. That's the most important method of your service. So in my onBind override, all I'm doing is calling get binder. Remember that the binder, the iBinder, defines the interface that the clients are going to use. And the clients are going to use the messenger interface, which is the incoming handler. We get called right up in here in handle message. And that's pretty much it for my service. So let's build that, make sure it runs. Looks good. I could install that on my emulator. Let's do that. It will just be installed so that I can later use it. It says I don't have a default activity. You can easily get around that by just going to run, and you want to edit configurations. You want to select your app, and you just want to say no default activity and say OK. So now I'm going to install this on the emulator, and that will be on there. So now that when I have a consumer, I can go ahead and use that. And we want to make sure that everything's good, and we just have to make sure that this is final. And we don't need to make it public either. So that can just be a final static. So let's build that again, install it on our emulator. And again, when we need to use it, we'll bind to it. I just want to get that installed on there. Now that it's installed, we have to create a consumer. The consumer is the application that's going to bind to the service and send it some data so that it can be logged. So I want to create a new module inside the same project. I'm just going to go to File, New. Say New Module, and I'm going to create this as a phone and tablet module, and I'm going to call it Logging Consumer. And I'm going to keep everything the same, and I am going to add an empty activity because this is going to have a user interface so that I can send something over to be logged. So I'm going to say Next. I'm going to generate the layout file. I'm going to say Finish. First thing I want to do is I want to add my user interface for the layout. It's going to be a simple user interface that just has a text view and a button to send over to the service. So here is I'm going to use a relative layout. Save it. It has it on click. It's just a simple user interface to send some data. All right, so in my main activity, there's a couple things I want to do. I'm going to set my layout when I come in with the onCreate, And that's all I need to do in my onCreate. In order to bind to a service, we need to implement that service connection class, in particular the onServiceConnected method and the onServiceDisconnected. So all you need to do here is you need to create some empty handlers or some empty overridden methods for our service. So I want to do something like this. And the first thing you want to do, we'll keep those empty for now, is we have these two methods that we want to implement for our service. So we create a service connection, we say mConnection, new anonymous inner class that has two methods that we need to implement. We want to create some member variables for our service. And again, we're using a messenger object to communicate with our service. So we need to create a member variable for our messenger. Something like that. That's going to be used as the interface. We also want to have a Boolean that tells us whether or not we have bound to our service. This will help us when we need to delete the service and so forth. In our onServiceConnected, all we need to do is create a new messenger and set our Boolean equal to true, meaning that we're bound to the service. So something like that. Set our mService, new messenger service, create a new instance, and set bound to true. When we're disconnected, we want to set the service to null, and we want to set our Boolean to false. Pretty simple there. I also want to create some formatting of my data. So I'm going to create a couple instances and objects up here for member variables that help with that. Mainly, I'm going to create a calendar, a simple date format, because I want to have timestamps for all of my logging, and a couple strings. I want to make sure I import all of the correct libraries, because again, there's some ambiguity in here, so I just want to do that. And now for the rest of the application, I want to handle the onClick so that when I do click a button, I want to send some data over using the messenger. So when I click a button, I want to add my button send. This is my event handler for clicking the button. Button send view. And I want to create some text, and I also want to get the text values from the edit text. Right, typical boilerplate type stuff. Get the calendar, get the date, and then get the edit text box so that I can use that text to send over to the service. If the text is empty, I just want to replace it with a line feed, so this is just for some help. If I have an empty text string, I just want to set the formatted input to some kind of input. I also want to make sure that I'm bound to my service. If I'm not bound to my service, I don't want to try to send any data to it. So I'm going to check my Boolean variable, and I'm going to say if I'm not bound, return immediately. And I want to make sure that I have my ending brackets. Actually, no, I want to only bound if it's empty. Now I need to add some data to a bundle so that I can send data to the service. So I want to create a bundle instance here. And this should look familiar from previous. Create a new bundle, put a string inside that bundle, and then use my messenger class to send the data over. And we can easily send data to a service by using the send method. This is one of the easiest implementations of binding to a service. So I create a new message. I can just say obtain, and I can set my message. So I'm going to set it to 1 because remember in our service, we set our save to file equal to 1. This can be any number. We want to make sure we send the right message over. So here I set my what equal to 1. I set the first parameter null, and I set my bundle. And then all I have to do is use my service instance and call the send message with the message. And that will send a message to my service. And then we want to end our onClick. The only other thing we need to do is we need to implement the onStart and the onStop methods of our class. So in the onStart, we want to bind to the service by using that external intent. So I'm going to override the onStart. I'm going to call super onStart. I'm going to create my new intent, which is my service name. Remember in our manifest for our service, we gave it a name. Remember log service? We have to use that in our intent when we want to call the service. So inside my consumer, my main activity, I want to specify my intent for that service. I also have to set the package name for that service since it's in a different package. I then call bind service on that connection, and I say auto create. So when my application starts up, it will automatically bind to the service. I put this in onStart instead of onCreate because in case we go back, we want to, onCreate, remember, only gets called once. If I stop the application, it goes to a stop state, I want to unbind. So if I'm currently bound, I want to unbind the service and set the Boolean to false. Okay, and that's really the implementation for it. So let's just recap a bit. We have our main activity. It has a user interface. It's going to send text to a service. So I created a couple member variables. For the service, in order to bind to a service, we're using a messenger, so we have an instance of a messenger. And we have to implement our service connection. We create a new instance of that, new service connection, and then we have two methods that are going to get called. They're callback methods. OnService connected and OnService disconnected. When we get OnService connected, we create our new messenger and set the Boolean to true. Otherwise, we set it to false. When we hit the send button, this is when we format our text that's in the edit text, and when we actually create our bundle and get a message and then call the send message on our service. Pretty basic. And then we bind to the service and unbind the service in our onStart and onStop activity lifecycle methods. So let's try to build this and install it. And actually, before we start it, we want to make sure that our logging, our service, has the correct permissions, because we can't request them at runtime. So I'm just going to manually change them on the device. So we go to app settings, to app notifications. We can go to our app info. Since I installed the service, I should see it on there. And I can go ahead and change the permissions on that. So I'm going to select logging service, and I'm going to select permissions, and I'm just going to say storage, and I'm going to select yes. So now we'll see that logging service has permissions for storage. Just a workaround because I'm trying to write a service application that was useful, and I thought logging would be useful because many applications in the system could use this service. And it's nice that it's bound and that it only has a lifetime of when the application actually needs to log. It's not running forever. So now if we start the logging consumer, it should bind to it and we should be able to send it data. So let's start up logging consumer. Let's try to write some data in here. What's up, Jason? Hit the send button, and on the send button we should see a text with the timestamp and then the data. But to see if it's actually logged in external storage, we'll have to use DDMS. So let's bring up Android Studio, go to Android Device Monitor, and let's look on the device to see if it's there. We can look at external storage by going to, let's make sure I have access to data. Remember, if you didn't start ADB up as root, you won't have access to data, so I just want to make sure. Okay, I'm able to access data, but we want to look at external storage. So we want to go to storage, emulated, 0, and remember we wrote the data in the downloads directory. So if we go and download, we see that we have our logging service. If we look at this, we pull it off the device, and we save it in, let's say downloads. We can open it up and see if it wrote our data to the log. So if I bring it up in Notepad, you can see that it was written with the timestamp. It just says, "What's up, Jason?" And so here is a demonstration that just allows us to bind to a service and write data to an external storage. It's just a simple service application that does some logging. I hope you found this useful. I'll provide the zip file as a resource. You can check it out. Again, we did the workaround with permissions. We extended the service class, and we added the service to the manifest file. And the messenger just makes it real easy to implement. You know, we can just override the handle message and and do whatever we need to in that service. In this case, saving some data to a file. And then we have that important onBind method that we need to implement that defines the interface. And then the client becomes rather easy. Thank you.